Alright, so I'm trying to get back to something resembling my schedule again after having a big theory to put together, and then also life just kind of made things hectic for a while. So let's get into Avatar: The Last Airbender, one of my favorite series to cover here on the channel. Today we're talking about Avatar Roku Part 2 of the Winter Solstice. A two-parter. I do use the term two-parter, though, very loosely here, because as I mentioned in the previous review, there's not a whole lot stitching these two episodes together. Like, aside from the fact that the setup for this episode hijacked another perfectly good plot and diminished that specific plot down to like half of the episode that was supposed to be dedicated to it, there's really nothing connecting these stories together at all. Like, yes, the gang starts out in the village that they saved in the previous episode. They get supplies from them. They're supported by them. These people genuinely believe that they can accomplish the task of the day, which is to infiltrate into the Fire Nation and get to the Crescent Island, where the Fire Nation Avatar Temple is located, so that Aang can talk to Avatar Roku. And of course, seeing as how they leave from that village, it is the setting of a bit of conflict at the beginning, where Aang tries to leave without Sokka and Katara because he doesn't want to put them in this much danger. But otherwise, like, this episode could have started from anywhere. They could have started anywhere, set out from anywhere, and it wouldn't have made much of a difference. And while this episode is really good, I think it's better than the previous episode. In part because it's just better than the previous episode, and also in part because the lore here does hold up, unlike the lore in the previous episode, up until Korra severely retcons some stuff later. And so, frankly, if you're going to sacrifice either one of these episodes for the other, I'm glad that it's the previous one and not this one. But if you'll allow me a moment before I get into the episode proper to discuss something, I do still think both of these episodes could have been pretty great. I don't think you needed to sacrifice one to the other to make them work. I recall that someone even mentioned in the comments of my previous Avatar review that maybe if they had just moved the stuff with Roku's dragon telling Aang where to go to the end of the episode, it would have helped things flow better and made the episode stronger. And I totally agree. Just that would have helped, instead of sticking it in the middle of the episode where it didn't belong, interrupting the episode's own plot. But I still think that you could have made the episode even stronger than that without really sacrificing anything. Like, yeah, the stuff with Aang riding his previous life's spirit animal around the way he does Appa is pretty cool. But we didn't need to see him go all the way to the Fire Nation. Like, yeah, that's the explanation for how he knew how to get to that island, and where on the island the room with Roku's statue was. But I would argue that he didn't need to know those things, because he already knows those things. I talked about this in the previous review too, but Roku even confirms it at the end of this episode, and this is that lore bit that remains consistent until Korra inexplicably retcons it later. Aang is Roku. Roku is Aang. They are the same person. Roku is part of Aang. If Aang needs to talk to Roku in the future once he's ready, he can talk to Roku, because Roku is part of him. Everything that was Roku is now part of Aang, because they're the same person. That's how reincarnation works. Aang and Roku and all of the other avatars are not just different, distinct people strung together by some obscure spirit creature thing. They are the same person, aspects of the same person. The stuff with Roku's dragon could have been as simple as the dragon showing up, like touching its tail to his head or something, and he sees a bunch of images, and then like maybe contextualizes the images a little bit to Sokka and Katara later to explain to us what he saw and why he feels that he needs to go. Like something as simple as, I met Roku's dragon in the spirit world, and when I saw him, I was reminded of all these things that Roku knew. A temple in the Fire Nation on a Crescent Island, and a comet. And I don't know why, but that comet's dangerous. But I think Roku does know, and he wants to tell me I need to go to that temple, because I can talk to him there. Like, there's a ticking clock element to all of this too. He knows he has to get there before the winter solstice ends. You'd have to work that in somehow too. But I think you could pull it off, and only devote maybe like 5 minutes of screen time to it total. You could even probably condense a couple of scenes in this episode down into just 1 or 2 scenes instead of the several that we got. And while it might have hurt the pacing of the episode a little bit, you could have used that extra time to even stick some of that exposition in this episode to save even more time in the last one. They did need to kind of recap the previous episode a little bit in the dialogue in this one anyway, just to make things flow naturally. You would almost have had to have framed it more as Aang being reminded of all this stuff when he saw the dragon, rather than the dragon telling him this stuff on Roku's behalf. But I think that could have worked just as well, and maybe even better considering what the Avatar is supposed to be. Frankly, at the end of the day, though, it doesn't matter. As I mentioned in the review of the last episode, that one is still kind of unmemorable. A character from it returns later, but otherwise, there's not much reason to give that episode a second thought. The lore in it is pretty readily contradicted later on, after all. So I'm not going to dwell on it any longer. And this episode, for what it's worth, is pretty freaking amazing. It starts out very tense. Our characters have to rush. They have to leave right now, or they're definitely not going to make it before the solstice ends. But as we saw in the previous episode, Zuko is right behind them. He's effectively caught up to them, and he's able to, let's say, coerce the information from the villagers as to where Aang and the others are currently going. He is not technically allowed in the Fire Nation, so he does need to try to catch them before they get there. But this is the closest he's ever been to finding them. He's not going to just stop. So we have a race against time, we have a race against Zuko, and as Zuko bears down on the gang, they come upon a blockade of Fire Nation ships that's probably just there because it's on the border between the Fire Nation and the Earth Kingdom, and they're blockading the Earth Kingdom, right? But it does present a bit of a problem. They could go around the blockade, but they don't have time for that. They have to run it if they're going to make it in time, which leads to a very tense scene where these Fire Nation ships are shooting fireballs up at them, and they're having to dodge every single one. And my favorite scene from this entire sequence being when Aang flies Appa up above the clouds, hoping to avoid the fireballs by removing the Fire Nation's visibility, but the fireballs just keep coming up above the clouds anyway, and now Aang can't see where they're coming from to as effectively dodge. Sokka almost falls to his death because of this mistake. I also want to praise this entire sequence for being one of the areas where I feel like the sometimes out of place and inappropriate humor of this show actually works. In that scene where Sokka almost falls, they swoop very close to the water to catch him, and when they do, a fish pops up and Momo jumps up and catches it. It's not the most hilarious thing ever, but as tense as the scene was, it got a chuckle out of me because it broke the tension so quickly and effectively and efficiently without overstaying its welcome. It's also super neat that in this, a pretty landmark episode, this is when Aang talks to Roku for the first time, right? It just so happens that the blockade is commanded by Commander Zhao, the real villain of the first book of this show. Because remember, Zhao wants the Avatar for himself. He wants to steal that glory that Zuko believes should go to him. So when he realizes what's happening, that the Avatar is trying to get to some place within the Fire Nation, and that Zuko is following him and likely has some idea of where he's going, he lets Zuko through. He lets Zuko go home, because he knows that following Zuko's damaged, battered ship that's spewing smoke up into the air will be easier than following a flying bison that blends in with the clouds. And even though Zuko does have the idea to go off on his own and let his own ship act as a decoy to lead Zhao off his trail, by then they're already close enough that Zhao is able to work out where the Avatar was going, and so Zuko eventually shows up at the temple, almost captures Aang, and then Zhao turns up at the temple too and almost captures all of them. There's these layers upon layers of strategy here that make the episode just super satisfying to watch. Seeing one character after another outmaneuver the people around them, only to be outmaneuvered as well, leaves you guessing as to where things are going to go next. This episode's very unpredictable like that. We also get a good example of Sokka's strategy here too, where they try to use fake firebending to get through a door that can only be opened by 5 firebenders working together. And when it doesn't work, and the door still doesn't open, we see Katara being less book smart than her brother, but still very clever, recognizing that it looks like it worked. The various fire priests, or whatever they were called, might not realize that it didn't work and might just open the door to see if it did. And then they can sneak inside that way. It's a great example of the kind of strategy stuff that we see in this show. The characters' plans typically don't wholesale succeed or fail. They're usually able to lay the groundwork of a plan, but they still have to think on their feet and make the plan work in real time. I also love the politics that come into play here. We meet these, what were they called? Fire sages? Is that what it was called? I don't remember. The people who are meant to keep Roku's temple. Servants of the Avatar exclusively. Except in the intervening 100 years, they've been usurped by the Fire Nation government. They work for the Fire Lord now instead of the Avatar, in part because it took the Avatar so long to return, and their order lost faith. But in a great bit of setup for the fact that later on, the Fire Nation is going to be shown to be a nuanced place with a whole bunch of nuanced kinds of people. One of the sages isn't that. He still believes in the Avatar, and when he realized, along with all the other ones, when the statue first glowed, because of what happened back at the Air Temple a few episodes back, while the others started making preparations to capture the Avatar for the Fire Lord when he showed up, this last sage did the opposite. He started preparing to help the Avatar reach Roku's room when he arrived. This makes him a traitor to the Fire Lord, and eventually the other 4 sages also get branded traitors as well, and as far as I know, we never hear from them again. So they're probably dead, right? But he is still instrumental in Aang reaching that room. I mentioned earlier that Roku would have known how to get to that room anyway, but this guy would have been here to lead them, too. They were going to find the statue room regardless of what happened. And the talk with Roku is super cool. He is very familiar with Aang, because of course he is. They're the same person, and yet they still have a sort of mentor-mentee dynamic. It's just immediately very appealing. And while he has this wise sageliness to him, even his voice comes off that way, he's still dynamic and intimidating, and when Aang uses the Avatar state to channel Roku's spirit so that Roku can get them out of the situation at the end, first of all, because of all we know about the Avatar up to this point, this doesn't feel like it comes out of nowhere. It feels like a natural progression of events, which is very cool for what is basically a Deus Ex Machina. But it's also just super satisfying to see. Roku was a fully powered, fully realized Avatar, the thing that Aang now has to strive even harder than ever to become. So seeing him fight here, even though it's very brief, is sort of a preview of what we're going to get from Aang come the end of the series, because, and we know this is going to happen because of the dialogue between himself and Roku. Obviously, Aang has had the goal of trying to restore balance ever since the beginning of the series. He's set out specifically to find a waterbending mentor so that he can learn waterbending and then move on to earth and firebending, become a fully realized Avatar, and put the Fire Nation back in their place. That's his goal. But just like this episode introduced a 1-episode time crunch, forcing our characters to work against the clock to get here in time to talk to Roku in the first place, Roku introduces a time crunch for the whole show. A comet, which this makes literally no sense, but it's part of the lore of the show, I have to accept it. A comet, Sozin's Comet, which acts like a second sun in the sky, therefore doubling the power of any firebenders beneath it, is set to make another pass by, I guess it's still called Earth in this universe, by Earth by the end of summer. And at that point in time, the Fire Lord will use its power to finish the war that Sozin started 100 years ago. There will be nothing that anyone can do. Aang must learn the other elements by the end of summer. Realize this is the winter solstice right now, so we know exactly how long that is, how long he has left. Because, like, yeah, he could go and fight the Fire Lord now, technically speaking, But he's still a child, and the Fire Lord's the Fire Lord. Learning the other elements first, and then confronting Ozai before the comet comes back is the best option all around. It's a daunting task, because Roku even says an avatar mastering the elements usually takes years. And yet he still has faith in Aang, because he knows that Aang has done this before. He can channel that and make the process a little bit easier for himself if he needs to. Because again, he and all of the previous avatars are the same person. That experience is in there somewhere. He just needs to reach deep enough to find it. Like, on paper, this episode doesn't feel like much. It's some lore stuff, it's some skirmishes with the Fire Nation, it's the same kind of stuff we get in a lot of different episodes, but the various layers to it are what make it really strong. Like I mentioned the bit of levity with Momo earlier, there's more of it here at the end that fits just as seamlessly into what's going on. Our characters are trying to escape, Roku has given them the opening, but now they need to make it count. And we see Momo come flying around to scoop them up with Appa. And like, that would be cool enough, because it speaks to how intelligent Momo actually is, and how intelligent Appa is to recognize when Momo wanted his help. But earlier, in an earlier scene, we saw Momo steal one of the big, weird Pope hat looking things. They probably have a real name, I don't know what it is. I apologize. From one of the Fire Sages, I think it was like the leader of the 5 Fire Sages or whatever. And as he comes swooping around with Appa at his back, he's now wearing the hat. And it's such a cute detail. And again, it made me laugh. Like, not a ton. It didn't make me like raffle or whatever. But it was just the right amount of levity for that exact moment where all of the conflict up to that point was finally coming to a head. This episode does what a lot of past episodes and a lot of future episodes of this show have done and will do respectively, but it does all of those things even so much more flawlessly than a lot of other episodes ever do. It's not like the best episode of this show or anything, but it's definitely up there, especially among season 1 episodes, and especially considering how exposition heavy it is. It's from this point forward that the show really gets going, as the stakes have been set. Up until now, things have been kind of vague. We know the Fire Nation is bad. We know they're oppressing people. We know they're spreading their influence. They're trying to conquer these other places. But now we have a very clear picture of what will happen and when. It almost feels like the show has been missing something up to this point, with that detail not being there, and knowing the detail fills that gap. As per usual, though, I'd like to know, what do you guys think of Winter Solstice Part 2, Avatar Roku? If you have seen it, let's get a discussion going in the comment section down below. And while you're down there, you might as well like the video, share it with anyone else you think would enjoy my content, subscribe if you haven't. You can also check out links to my various social medias, as well as the many ways you can help out the channel. Those will be in the video description. But either way, this has been AJ22, and I will talk to you guys later.